Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to our book launch discussion. My name is Parja Pandey. I lead the climate finance research stream at the Observer Research Foundation, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you all to today's proceedings. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Mr. Jairam Ramesh for his presence at the event. I'm sure that Mr. Ramesh is well known to most of you. He started his career at the World Bank 40 years ago. He's worked across a myriad of departments in the Indian government, including the Planning Commission. No, I mean, I meant 18 years ago. He's worked across a myriad of departments, including the Planning Commission, the Ministry of Industry, and pretty much any department that has anything to do with economics. He's also worked as an advisor to the state governments of Karnataka, Rajasthan, and Chhattisgarh. He's represented India internationally as a member of the 1999 World Trade Organization delegation, and was the chief negotiator for India at the 2009 UN Climate Change Conference in Copenhagen. Most importantly, of course, Minister Ramesh was the former Minister of Forests and Environment from 2009 to 2011, and the Minister of Rural Development from 2011 to 2014. So, to give the opening remarks, I'd like to welcome Minister Jairam Ramesh to the stage.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I want to congratulate the young author for producing a book which has an arresting title, Taming the Sun. It reminds me of a story of what happened in '53 when India's Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, was told by a Reuters correspondent that Mount Everest has been conquered. And Mr. Nehru flew into a rage and said, well, Mount Everest can never be conquered. Hillary and Tenzing have only climbed Mount Everest. So when you read Taming the Sun, it could well be that the sun can never be tamed, it can only be harnessed, but it's certainly a very arresting title for a book, and I want to congratulate the young author. We are right now in Solar 3.0, the third era of solar energy. Many of you would not know, in fact, very few people know that India took major strides in solar energy in the 50s. And there was a big debate in this country whether India should invest in nuclear power or in solar power. And there was a very famous historian, he was really not more than a historian, he was sort of the Da Vinci of India of the 20th century, Didi Kosambi, who was then at the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. And he had a big debate with Homi Bhabha, the founder of our nuclear program. And Kosambi wrote three major pieces on solar energy in 57, 1960 and 1964, arguing that the route for India is solar and not nuclear. Bhabha, of course, believed that the route for India lay in thorium and not necessarily in solar. They had a falling out, and then Kosambi left and passed away prematurely, as did Bhabha. But I just want to point out that in the 50s, there was this debate in this country, and for a variety of reasons, we made a huge investment in nuclear establishment. We made a huge investment in nuclear science. We did not make the same degree of investment in solar at that point of time, because we perhaps believed that nuclear epitomized modernity and solar somehow epitomized tradition and a backward-looking economy. When I came back to India in the early 80s, not quite 40 years, but when I came back to India in the early 80s, I started working on solar energy 2.0. The government of India had just started, when Mrs. Gandhi was the Prime Minister, she had been persuaded by her scientific advisors to start a national solar photovoltaic demonstration program. It was a 1 megawatt program. Just imagine, talking of the early 80s. And we had a company called Central Electronics, as a public sector company. And this was India's first step into solar energy. We were producing silicon wafers. The silicon was imported, of course. And then there were plans to set up a national silicon facility. Subsequently, BHEL invested, and Tata BP Solar was one of the first joint ventures going back into the 80s. And at that time, the focus was on solar pumping, solar lighting for commercial purposes, and use of low-grade solar thermal heat in industry. So we started taking the first steps into realizing India's solar potential. But what happened immediately after the mid-80s, oil prices started falling dramatically in real terms. And, we lost interest in solar. And so solar 2.0, like solar 1.0, went nowhere. Over the last 10, 15 years, particularly after the mid-90s, the whole international discourse changed. Greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide emissions, climate change, these were new factors that were not there in the 50s and in the 80s. And solar energy got a new propulsion. And in 2008, the then government announced a very ambitious plan of 20 gigawatts of solar capacity by the year 2022. And the present government, when it came to power in 2014, was even more ambitious and even more aggressive and increased that target fivefold. So the target now is that we should have 100 gigawatts of solar capacity by the year 2022. We are right now at about 12 gigawatts. On the ground, it's much less. On paper, we are at 12 gigawatts. But on the ground, I estimate that we are at somewhere between 8 to 9 gigawatts. So we are firmly now, I think, unlike the first phase or the second phase, I think solar is here to stay. It's very much part of the energy option now, both because of the domestic reason. The costs have come dramatically down. When I was minister, for example, we were talking of solar prices at in excess of 20 rupees a unit. And now we are talking of solar prices at less than 3 rupees a unit. Nuclear costs have gone up post Fukushima, and solar costs have come dramatically down. And that's the big narrative change domestically that's happened. The narrative has changed internationally with the concern on fossil fuels, the fact that India today is the fourth largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. No matter that per capita we are very low, but in absolute terms we are the fourth largest. And by the year 2030, the way at which we are going, we may end up being the world's second largest emitter, occupying the position that the US is in today. So both the domestic context and the international context have changed. I want to make just one substantive point, and then we'll listen to the author because it's really his evening and not mine, that India's solar strategy has to follow what I have been saying, a twin track approach. We've got to chase the gigawatts, but we've also not to forget the kilowatts. Naturally, we have to chase the gigawatts because that's what gives us the brownie points internationally. That's what helps us to meet our obligations under the Paris Climate Agreement. But the real impact of solar lies in the potential that it offers for decentralized energy production, decentralized energy distribution. And if we are going to substitute one form of vertically integrated fossil fuel system with another form of vertically integrated solar system, we are not getting the full advantage of this technology. So we have to set up utilities, no doubt, but at the same time, I think India must look at what the Germans have done very, very seriously. Germany today, everybody knows that Germany, about a third of German electricity production on a day-to-day basis is from renewables, largely solar. But what most people forget, that in a nation of 80 million people, Germany now has almost 7 million energy producers. So 1 out of every 10 virtually Germans is producing energy. The point is, solar energy in Germany has not only contributed to supply, but has shaken up the structure of the electricity generating industry. I don't see that happening in India as yet. What I see in India is big fossil fuel companies becoming big solar companies. But the great innovativeness of solar will come when you, as I said, the decentralized nature, the redesigning of your electricity grid, a huge opportunity for us in the re-architecturing of the grid, the convergence of different energy sources, the investment in energy storage, which is bound to undergo major technological advances in the years to come. I think what we have seen in mobile telephony in the last decade, we will see in energy storage in the next decade. And what may appear to be somewhat of a utopian dream today may certainly not be that utopian 10 years from now. Today, 1 gigawatt of solar requires commensurate corresponding 1 gigawatt of fossil, either coal or nuclear. That may not be the case 10 years from now. So that's the one thought I want to leave you with, that gigawatts are important, but kilowatts are equally important. We have 50 million homes in this country which do not have access to electricity, a large number of villages where grid electricity is simply not economic to extend, and here the solutions really lie in renewables like solar. You can't open the papers without reading a headline about prices falling, some bid being opened, and it's becoming very newsy as well. And this is something that I think is good. It's good for us internationally, but most importantly, it's good for us domestically as well.
So, Kanika Chawla is senior program lead at the Center for Energy, Environment, and Water, and as you've heard, she has recently developed a very innovative financial instrument that is going to be used by the World Bank.
Council on Energy, Environment, and Water.
Council.
That's fine.
Mr. Selwicks is the first counselor for the U.S. Embassy and concentrates on energy matters. So let's get started. Kanika, do you want to give us a general overview about the state of the Indian solar industry and also maybe talk a little bit about your financial instrument?
Sure. So I think that Varun's book's really interesting because it talks about what the sun can do, but it also talks about what the sun can't do, not the way that it's doing it now. But in the Indian context, I think that we're at a point where we're finally realizing that the sun or solar energy is really something that we can count on, that it's not going to be a fringe player anymore. And so going forward, I think that it's important for us to realize all the things that we've got right in the solar sector. One of the big wins for India has been that we've followed a transparent bidding process. And we've never really had the big incentive-based or feed-in tariff-based solar electricity market, which has actually been one of the big lessons that we've learned from other economies. And that's one of the reasons why we've been able to drive down prices as rapidly as we have been. And so the thing that we've got right is that we've created a market that has competition, and the scaling up of the target has also got a lot of different players to start responding to policy signals and creating sort of more market dynamics. But the thing that we've not necessarily got right is that we've not been able to remove the perception of risk. And like Varun said, we have not been able to open the floodgates of investment even when there are investors waiting to invest. They are looking for new markets. They're looking for investment opportunities in India. They're looking to redirect investment away from thermal, but are not feeling confident to necessarily do that in solar. And some of the reasons for that are the risks that are sort of quite specific to solar as a technology. And one of them is that it's decentralized. It's the size of each individual investment is far too small for a big investor to take notice. But also some of them are more macroeconomic concerns that are specific to India, as well as regulatory concerns that are specific to India. And those are some of the things that still need to be resolved. I think that we've made huge advances in the last few years, but there is still a very, very long way to go if we're going to come close to realizing the targets that we've set for ourselves.
Thanks, Kanika. Ray, would you like to perhaps give us an overview about the state of the U.S. solar industry, especially given recent developments?
I'd be happy to make a few comments. First of all, I want to say thank you for inviting me to be here with you. I actually think that Varun's in a much better position to talk about the U.S. market because I focus on the Indian market, and I'm not an expert in either of them. But I'm happy to make a few quick observations. I think that people like Varun are destined to be really key players in a global revolution that, as the minister suggested, is really going to transform the world we live in. And hopefully soon, because we don't have a lot of time. I think it's really critical that we, as a globe, really take this issue seriously. And the challenge is that it's a multifaceted question. On the surface of it, it looks like it's simple. It's just a matter of inventing the right technology. But what we've learned, and I think this is the focus of the book, is that you really need to be innovating and creating a revolution on 4 separate tracks at the same time and in an integrated way, because it's the investment, and it's changing the way we think about investing. One of the weaknesses we have in the United States, frankly, is that it is difficult to mobilize capital for long-term ventures in a way that attacks market failures, that really address that problem. And if you think about climate change, it's the mother of all market failures. And so we need to reimagine the way we deploy capital and think about how you overcome those market failures. And you need to be doing that at the same time you are evolving the technology. And so it's a huge challenge because you may be mobilizing capital around one technology, and within a couple of years, the technology may be moving even faster than you had anticipated. So there's some really fascinating challenges that we all have to deal with. And it's exciting to see a room here full of people who are really seasoned experts and have lots of experience in this field, and young people as well, because I think it's that diversity and that passion and it's coming together that will help us really come out on top in this issue. Thanks, Ray.
Thank you. So one of the issues that's touched upon within the book is the need to deal with electricity grids and to allow for the upgrade electricity grids to allow for the integration of renewables and also transferring power across different regions, different states. Varun, do you want to speak a little bit about the challenges associated with that and possible solutions?
Totally. You know, each country is going to face its own set of challenges. The more solar you have, though, this is a constant around the world, the more solar you have, the harder your job is to make sure that at every moment you're balancing electricity supply with electricity demand. See, in other forms of energy, you have the benefit that your energy source kind of sits there. Your fuel tank holds on to oil or gasoline or diesel. You don't have to use it every moment. But in electricity, every moment you've got to balance supply and demand. So the right solution is going to depend on whether you're California or you're India, whether you're at 10% solar or 20%. Recently, our renewable energy laboratory in the United States did a study for India. It said, how on earth is India going to integrate all of this solar? We talked about 100 gigawatts. What are we going to do with 100 gigawatts? And I think 175 gigawatts overall of renewable energy. What are we going to do with it? Well, it turns out the top 2 things that you can do to make sure that you integrate all of this is to build out transmission. And the Indian government is, albeit slowly, investing in these transmission corridors to take energy, evacuate it from areas where there's a lot of sun to areas where there's a lot of demand. And the second thing you can do, you might not expect this. Actually, show of hands. Who thinks the second thing you can do is storage? Raise your hand. Okay, I got at least a few of you. The rest of you are like, no, he's not going to say storage. He doesn't like storage. The second thing you can do is what's known as coordinated dispatch. This is a really geeky, nerdy term, but what it means is in an electricity market, if you increase the geographic scale over which you coordinate how electricity is sent out, is scheduled for delivery, well, if you do that on a bigger scale, you're able to make sure that if there's a lot of solar here, well, we can send it over there. Right now in India, it's done on a sub-state scale, meaning little regions do their own dispatch. If you coordinate it at the state level, or even better, at the national level, you don't have to throw away as much solar as you would if you do it at the very small level. So my point is to say there are a lot of different strategies. They're going to depend on what region you're in. And in India right now, what we need to do is some of these strategies that exist in the developed world and have been used for a long time. Coordinated dispatch is well used and understood. We need to deploy that here now.
Absolutely. I think there are a few states that do transference across state lines, but they are pretty rare. So, it's a huge issue in India. Curtailment rate for solar can reach something like 50%. Our T&D, transmission and distribution losses are around 20%. Kanika, as a finance expert on the panel, how can the Indian government bring in financial innovation to help upgrade the grid? Is there a way for the private sector to come in?
So actually, I wanted to also respond to something that Varun was saying earlier, and Mr. Ramesh also mentioned this in his comments around whether it is a supply side issue or a demand side issue, and how we look at energy in this country. And in my experience and from what I understand, we have always thought of energy and dealt with energy from the supply side. We have never, ever thought to move the needle on the demand side. And that does not, sort of immediately mean that we need to do smart metering and have a completely literate user base, or every consumer needs to be able to know when is peak load, when is off peak. That is not what is required. But we do need behavioral nudges for households to become prosumers, as we heard also earlier, for households to participate in this energy transition. Because private investment isn't always necessarily from institutional investors and large insurance companies or pension funds. Private insurance also means that I'm going to pay for the rooftop solar system that I want to install on my house. Right? And I'm going to piggyback on existing networks. They're similar to what Varun was talking about is happening in East Africa with the telephone networks, with M-KOPA and other such things. And so we don't do enough to move the needle on the demand side. And for that, I think that there needs to be much more attention paid to the behavioral aspect. And the other way to sort of drive in private investment is if you use public money effectively. We use public money only to do things that we find are far too difficult to get private players to do it. But we don't bother to try and understand why the private players don't do it. If the private players don't do it, public money should probably be used to drive them in rather than to just pay for it all together. So why not use that money as a driver to sort of incentivize them to underwrite some of the risks that they find prohibitive, to fix some of the regulatory environment, to do aggregation of small projects, and then free up public money to extend transmission networks to upgrade the grid, because that is, in fact, the prerogative of the government. It is something that they are supposed to be doing. One other comment that I wanted to make around the cost of an energy transition. And a couple of months ago, we had a lot of commentary in India around the social costs of an energy transition and how it was because of renewable energy that the exchequer was being overburdened. And I'd like to sort of use this platform and Varun's book as sort of a routing to sort of strongly refute that point. The extension of the grid is not because we are going to integrate more renewable energy. It is because that is a development priority of the country and it should be extended. improving the transmission network, improving the technology of the grid, improving the integration of renewable energy is not a great service to renewable energy developers. It is not a cost to the economy that the renewable energy fuel type is imposing. But in fact, it is something that is a development requirement, and that would have to happen regardless of whether you had renewables or not. But with the declining prices in renewables and with the modular nature of renewable energy, you're actually going to be able to reach some of your other development priorities and very, very important political priorities more cheaply than you would be able to do it if you were extending the grid and using thermal power and following the improved stringent guidelines for higher quality coal. So actually, I think that there are many social benefits of renewables that we are not accounting for and only focusing on the costs that aren't really truly renewable energy costs.
Very eloquently said. Mr. Sobix, so one of the keys to helping developing nations achieve some of the targets that are mentioned in this book and achieving some of the targets in the 2015 Paris Agreement is through technology transfer and knowledge sharing. How do you see the future of the India-US relationship and transfer of technology and knowledge sharing, specifically with regards to solar?
Sure. So maybe I'll start out by saying that, so I'm not an expert in this field, but I'm a generalist. That's in my line of work. My employer, the U.S. Department of State, expects me to be a generalist and be able to do lots of different things around the world. But when this job came available here in India to work on energy issues, I really, seriously, I saw this as the chance of a lifetime, particularly for a non-expert to be able to be in this kind of position, to be here at such a consequential moment in history, in such a consequential place where one of the world's largest countries is in the midst of really a very transitional period in time. So I snapped it up. And I think that's really true. So for the United States and India, I would argue they're the world's two most consequential democracies. And I feel like that as the world faces this kind of critical moment in our history, the two of our countries working together, it's just really essential for us to do that, right? So during my time here in India, I've really focused on two areas. The first is renewable energy, and I've spent quite a bit of time working with Konica and CEEW and others trying to bring down the cost of finance. So again, that's one of the pieces, right? It's not necessarily technology transfer, but it's transfer of innovative approaches. We also have this program called the PACE program, the Partnership to Advance Clean Energy, where U.S. labs collaborate with labs here in India to do joint research to attack the technical piece. So I think that's an important piece on renewable energy as well. The other area that I've been focusing on is helping India to develop a natural gas economy, right? So solar on its own isn't really sufficient. It's not going to do it, at least in the near term. I mean, maybe there will be amazing breakthroughs 20 years down the road or so. But until that time happens, I think we need to find a way to burn fossil fuels more cleanly. And so right now we've developed this bilateral task force, the India-US Task Force on Natural Gas, where we bring US companies and Indian companies together. At a government level, we collaborate to try and get the regulatory framework, the policy framework right to enable India to make that transition to a natural gas economy where you can dramatically expand city gas distribution, where you can contemplate things like using liquefied natural gas for transportation.
They'll need a few more terminals.
You'll need a few more terminals. There's a lot of work to do. That's right. But I mean, the challenge is, at least right now, we have a difficult time putting sunshine in your gas tank, in your fuel tank for your vehicle. We're making progress in that regard. But I think it takes a holistic approach And again, because this problem is so multifaceted, and it's not enough just to attack the technology piece of it. You have to attack all of these issues. And so I think that's the approach that the United States hopes to take in collaborating with India, this holistic approach where we're looking at the finance piece of it, where we're looking at the technology piece of it. And so it's not enough to just transfer the technology, because if you don't have the right policy environment and you haven't mitigated the risk, you're not going to get there. So we look to take a more holistic approach.
Thank you. So since we're kind of focusing on finance, one of the key areas that you mentioned in your book, Varun, is innovation on the financial side. And you mentioned specifically syndication of loans, correct? Do you see that because of the issues that have happened in the past decade or so, do you think that that would be viable given the current international banking regulations and given the reputation of asset-backed securities?
Yeah, so, okay, let's jump into finance. I'll probably say something that will embarrass me, and Kanika will have to save me. When I think about what's the future of solar financing, how do you get over that funding scarcity speed bump, I think that we want to make solar projects as easy to invest in as other asset classes that investors really like to invest in. Investors really like to invest in oil and gas pipelines. They really like to invest in homes and autos. You can get an auto loan thanks to large, deep-pocketed investors and a whole host of other investors funding those loans through a process called asset-backed securitization. So what if solar could do the same thing? The problem is we've had a couple false starts. In my country, in the United States, we had this bright idea. People, if you're a big investor, you can't invest in a solar project because individual projects are really painful to do due diligence on. And once you own the project, well, you have liquidity risk. You're scared of not being able to sell it. So you just avoid investing in it, even if it's a really good investment idea for you. So the good idea was, let's take the solar projects, package them together into a bundle, and sell that bundle with shares on a public stock market. Sounds like a great idea, right? But on top of that, in the United States, we had to go, into capitalist overdrive mode and structure these vehicles so that they were super greedy and had conflicts of interest with their management structure. And so as a result, the stock prices of these vehicles went boom and then bust. And now all the investors are scared of them, right? We had a false start there. And then when it comes to securitization, this is a way of, if you have lots of people put solar on their rooftops, they can package those rooftops together, they can put that onto a bond market as a security, and the cash flows from those various investments can then be the underlying cash flows for the security, the same way as people fund mortgages. Well, that's scary too, because remember the 2008 financial crisis? That was because of asset-backed securitization and various derivatives of those securities. So there are a lot of reasons that investors are scared of doing these approaches, but fundamentally, I think that over the next couple of decades, we're going to see fundamentally sound and responsible ways to invest in solar that package together solar projects into a diversified portfolio. They can be large projects or small projects, and they give large investors a way to buy and trade them on public capital markets. We had some false starts, but not to shamelessly plug, if you read my book, I lay out the guidelines for how to do the next cycle of responsible investing. So with that, I'll stop embarrassing myself. I'm sure you have a bunch of better ways to do this. And we also want to hear about the CRMM approach.
Right. I'm very impressed that you got the acronym right.
I don't know what it stands for, but.
Should I just get into it then? So I think that from what Varun is saying, there's 2 or 3 quite important things important words to understand. He used the word liquidity, and he also used the example of automobiles. Why is it that in India, when you buy a scooty, which isn't really worth very much in rupee terms, it's quite easy to finance, but when you buy a solar panel, which is worth actually much more, it's very hard to finance that? Because there is a resale market for a scooty, but there is no resale market for a solar panel. And so actually, even though that is your collateral, there isn't really, even if I did hold it as a security, who would I sell it to? So I don't actually find it to be a very strong collateral. And the problem, therefore, is that there isn't liquidity in the market. But one of the reasons that there isn't liquidity in the market, and it goes back to some of the more behavioral aspects that I was talking about before, is because even for investors, there's a lack of awareness. Investors don't necessarily have people manning renewable energy desks or womaning them.
People.
And they just don't want to look into a new sector, especially when they're saying that the ticket size of individual projects is so small. And therefore, as a result of that, they have a much higher risk perception than the actual risk. And that delta is actually what's making all the difference. That is why the cost of finance is so high. The cost of finance is high because there are real risks too. I am not
Yeah,
saying that.
I was
And
gonna say-
political will needs to be sort of exerted to not only use public money to underwrite some of those risks, but also to sweeten the deal a little bit rather than go in on your own and squander public money. And so my sort of word of what should be happening rather than what is happening is we shouldn't use public money to do project financing, which is what we are doing. We should use public money to do R&D, like Varun suggests in his book. And we should use public money to underwrite risk so you can drive in private money and create liquidity in the market. So have a solar bond. Don't do it the way the Americans did it. Do it in a way where every single project is actually assessed by experts and a premium is placed on it. Different premiums for different projects, but once every project pays that premium, it is all at the same credit rating. You pool those projects together around the world, have a natural hedging benefit because of the diversity, and as a result, create a global marketplace for solar projects, and these solar bonds can be traded easily. This is actually the basic premise of the common risk mitigation mechanism, where you're saying all the non-project related risks. So there are risks that are specific to solar. You buy bad quality panels. That's the risk of doing business. You have insurances out there that operate in a private market that cover that risk and make actually a lot of money doing that. But there is a market to cover non-project risks, such as the risk of the poor financial health of utilities, so the off-taker risk, the risk of currency fluctuations, and the political risk of instability in a lot of the economies where they are abundant in solar resource but not abundant in financial resources. If you're able to bundle those resources, bundle them across countries, and create a marketplace for solar, you're really going to be able to access finance in a way that you've not been able to do before. New types of investors and existing investors at improved prices.
Can I follow up on that? Sorry, shameless plug as well. ORF does a lot of good work on financing and climate stuff as well. So check our website out. So you talked about some of the risks, and doing a globally diversified portfolio will mitigate quite a few risks. One of the big risks, however, is foreign currency risk. How would the credit risk mitigation fund be able to take care of that, or the vehicle?
So there are actually insurers around the world that already cover this risk. They do it at a premium that is often prohibitive. So at the moment in India, actually, if you were to get a forex cover for a solar project, you pay anywhere between 7 and 8%. So I'd rather just not do it and hope for the best, right? And that's actually what's happening. You're not getting these sub 3 rupee prices because everyone is buying forex cover or building in enough hedges in their bids. We are really flying by the seam of our pants right now, and we're waiting for, we could actually be in a lot of trouble. There could be a lot of NPAs, a lot of bust projects, if we don't actually find systemic solutions to these problems. But there is actually a natural benefit when you do it across multiple countries. So the more diverse your portfolio, you get an automatic benefit of the cost of hedging. That's the one part. And the other part is if you make all the different insurance companies compete with each other. At the moment, private and public insurers and reinsurers operate in very oligopolistic ways. One, they don't actually have access to new markets because sometimes countries don't allow them in. But often, other times, it's just too difficult to go into new and emerging economies. So it's almost divided up. Like AXA will do North Africa and Swiss Re will do East Africa. And I'm sort of... These are not the actual divisions, but it is really quite like this. And as a result, they're then able to charge whatever premium they want. But one, if you were able to do this using some amount of public money and you did it on cost reflective basis, And if you were able to make these different insurers and reinsurers compete with each other, because they'd have access to larger, more diversified markets, they'd have to undercut each other. So it's not going to ever be very, I mean, it is a business. They're going to want to make money of it. Or you can use public money to do it, in which case you don't have to make money of it, but you shouldn't really lose all the money either. That would be quite bad economics. Sorry. It's not.
Yeah, that would be bad economics to lose all of that.
But there is a way to, at least for the medium run, do long-term hedges. You're now actually able to hedge for about 20 years, and then a PPA doesn't run for much longer. Yeah. And actually, over time, you can have macroeconomic improvements because of it. I mean, that is the very long run, but there are actually ways to do it in a more efficient way, even if it is not extremely cheap. But it will be still significantly more efficient than it is now.
So I have a host of follow-up questions, but I'll ask them to you later. Let's open the floor up to questions. Do we have the roaming mics? Questions? Please.
I'm not sure whether it is.
It's on.
I'm not sure whether it is America or Germany, where you can put your solar energy to the grid, but not get the benefit out of it in your electricity bill. One of the two countries I'm absolutely sure
Definitely
is
America.
Huh?
Definitely
Parts
America.
of
Definitely America. Correct.
Very few parts. So look, this is an excellent question. It's a debate raging across our 50 states. The debate is because, historically, the way we started the distributed solar market, the way we got it off the ground was to say, if you generate electricity on your roof and you generate more than you use, you can sell the remainder back to the grid. And the way we'll compensate you is we will just take that amount off of your bill. So let's say, for the sake of argument, you use 10 kilowatt hours normally on your bill, and you pay 10 cents for each of those 10 kilowatt hours. So you pay $1, okay? Now, one of your kilowatt hours is coming from solar that gets sold to the grid. So now you pay 90 cents, not $1. Seems right, right? That turns out to be totally wrong. It turns out to be the absolutely wrong way to compensate you for having solar on your roof. Because by saving 10 cents on your bill, you are failing to pay the network costs, the costs of being connected to the grid that you still rely on even when the sun goes down and your solar is not generating anything. Now, you shouldn't get zero benefit. You shouldn't get 0 cents. But you also shouldn't get 10 cents. It should be somewhere in the middle. And in the United States, this debate is raging over where that exact amount should be. It's really hard to pick it. And I think it's a good debate to have. I don't think we should be at 10 cents. I don't think we should be at 0 cents. But around the world, like, I expect we're going to have the same debate. Here in India, we're having a net metering debate, and I think in India, we are where the United States was 10 years ago. Correct me if I'm wrong.
So we have a lot of net metering now. In Delhi, actually, if you did want to put a solar roof system and you wanted it to be net metered, it's oversubscribed, so you'd have to wait, like many other things that you'd have to wait for. But the important thing in that to understand as well is that, you know, often people who care about renewable energy and want to work towards the rapid increase of renewable energy deployment make the DISCOM the enemy. The utility in every geography around the world is the enemy of the transition. And it was for me too. But in recent months, I've started thinking about it from their point of view, just from a political economy thought process of like, why are they so troublesome? And it's a really, really hard place to be. You are losing your best customers because the economics is best for them. Because in India, we follow the sort of inverted structure, which actually I think is very good for energy efficiency. But so you lose all your best customers who pay you the most, but because they pay you the most, they now want solar. And then for everybody else, you have all of these commitments that are imposed on you to try and get them to adopt solar too. So the highest paying households will also start adopting it. Then not only are they using less electricity, they're also moving between different categories. So now they're paying less for each unit they're consuming as well. So really, I think that there needs to be much larger power sector reform and pricing reform, and of course that is the utopian want of everybody who works in the power sector. But it is quite important that we do that, because the energy transition will be incomplete without it.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Blaming the discoms themselves makes absolutely no sense. It's the larger power sector, and more than that, the rates that are set that are the real issue.
I have one question for Kanika. You mentioned public money should not be used for the development of solar in India. Whereas you must be aware, I mean, I'll not ask Varun this. In India, of course, the development in any respect is happening on public money, basically because it's the tax money which the exchequer has, and that's how the government takes reserves and utilizes it for the development of India. What do you foresee, and how do you what would you suggest or advise instead, wherein particularly for India, not for other developed countries, that how since finance is a big issue for the development of solar panel, what we are discussing for this. So how do you foresee, and what do you suggest? Yeah.
So the use of public money for solar energy is not something that I'm opposed to. So that's not exactly what I said, and I'd like to clarify, because otherwise I'll be expelled from the country. We should use public money for public good. Having solar power stations to power the economy, or at least a part of the economy, is very good business. And so we should let the people who do good business do it, which includes the independent power producers as well as private investors. However, they need some hand-holding, which is why public money should be used to facilitate the flow of private investment into private generation of solar power. And for that, you can use public money for insurance mechanisms to ensure that the investors will recoup their money, or it can be in the form of pooling different projects together so that they only have to put in especially for decentralized renewable energy, right? I don't want to give out 10 lakh rupees at a time. I'm LIC, for example. So I want to invest, I don't know, like 1 crore. So then how do I do it? And so public money can be used to do the due diligence and pool the different projects together. But if I were to use that public money to do direct transfer on financing of these projects, especially if I did it in grant mode, I'm not ever going to create a market. And nobody will ever want to pay for solar electricity, right? And so what I'm saying is that especially for utility scale solar projects, you actually can have a very competitive market. For newer markets, whether it's energy storage, whether it's solar irrigation, but even that, you have to create markets. But at least you put in some amount of seed money to get the market moving forward, to do R&D. Use taxpayer money for that. Don't use taxpayer money where private money can flow.
Yes, sir.
Hold on. Yes, please.
So I think your book is more appropriate for. Your book seems more appropriate for the U.S. than India, because India is not really an innovation society. It's not an implementation and execution society. Take clean drinking water. Nowhere in India is tap water safe to drink. That's not because the technology doesn't exist, but the administration is so poor. They just cannot provide that clean water. So technology is fine, but I think the problems for India are administrative, and there's no magic technology that's going to solve the problems of this country. The problem lies more in the character of the administration, and we have to get that act right before we come to these kinds of things.
Look, I think that's a great point. Not every country has the same role to play here. I actually think that I agree with you. The innovation in, for example, perovskite solar technology is probably largely going to come from some of the leading countries, South Korea, Japan, United States, European countries like Britain, and perhaps not from India, even though India does do actually very good solar research. It's not at the scale of some of these other countries. I think your point is very well taken, that there are important administrative reforms to be made. To go back to the last gentleman's question, I know you explicitly did not ask me this, but I'm going to answer anyway. I completely agree with Kanika. To date, 15% of all the solar financing has come from governments around the world. But governments cannot afford to do this going forward. At the scale of trillions of dollars in grant financing, it's not going to work. So the kinds of things you should do are what Kanika is saying. For example, a little bit of public money to get an insurance fund started to then crowd in private money. But I also think, to the gentleman's point just now, there are much larger structural reforms that one must do. Now, I want to make a point about politics. I hope I don't get in trouble here. One of the things I like about what this government's done here in India is make bankruptcy a real thing. It is a good thing that if you are a power sector company, you have a bunch of failing assets, that you get wiped out and your creditors get wiped out if your assets fail, because that injects the correct incentives into.
The latest reform that they're working on is just going to move those assets off to the NPTC. So yeah, they're still going to get away with it.
Well, they shouldn't.
That is not what is happening.
Yeah, that's definitely not like, especially what was just released a couple of days ago.
Fine.
Plan.
Broadly, the point is the incentives need to be right. They may or may not be right, but they need to be right. And those are the structural kinds of reforms you've got to make sure that folks compete on a level playing field. If it doesn't make economic sense to build or sustain coal plants, they shouldn't be built or sustained. If it does make economic sense, they should be. But those incentives have to be right.
One of the first time I actually met Varun in 2015, he was talking about how India doesn't spend enough money on R&D. And he's absolutely right, but it's also because we don't have the same kind of public money to invest in it, which is not to say that we should not invest more. But I think that there's an important distinction to make in the kinds of R&D that you do. And I think that countries should do what they have a competitive advantage in doing. And so it's important that India works on different applications of solar energy. So what can we do for other emerging economies? How do you do solar water filtration? How do you do solar desilting? How do you do solar water pumping in a way that Germany is never going to think about, right? Our agrarian needs are very different from the agrarian needs of the developed world. And we need to be a laboratory for the applications of solar, not necessarily for next generation solar, because we will never, ever have enough investment to make in that, nor the expertise. We're just too far behind. So we've got to play to our strengths and do something that actually creates value for other countries like ourselves.
I think Shikha Basan from the Council of Energy, Environment and Water has a question.
Thank you. Congratulations on the book, and it's great to hear this super interesting conversation. Get my head out of the Oxford Handbook on Public Policy. It's a good break. I want to pick up on a question that you actually raised, which was on R&D and public-private partnerships. And I'm really interested to hear what we've had all of this conversation on what are the models for financial innovation. At the end of the day, for technology innovation to be driven, you still need financial models backing that. So I'd be interested to hear from the panel if they have any thoughts on what a tech CRMM might look like.
What a cool question.
Yeah, go
ahead.
I think that there are some interesting models that are out there. The Israeli venture capital ecosystem was basically started as a public-private partnership. And I think that there's a lot that can be learned from that kind of hybrid. And they've been able to launch an entire technology sector using that hybrid model. That's something that I think is very interesting to look at, and is a research paper I want to do, so no one steal that idea.
Broadly, though, I've actually never thought about a CRMM for tech, in the sense that I think you're thinking about it as like, what if we were able to pool risk across geographies? Because these new technologies in the energy sector are extremely risky, and so far they've been localized in little pockets. Silicon Valley, for example, and then all the Silicon Valley companies failed. The more I think of it, I'm not actually sure it's a good idea to try and do a pan-geography approach. It might be, but let me tell you about some of the strategies I think we have learned from that wave of failures, for example, in Silicon Valley. The first thing we learned was that energy is unlike many other sectors where technology investing does work. Energy is not like software. A venture capitalist can invest in a software company and get his money back within 5 years. He'll still fail in 9 out of 10 times, but at least that one time is going to give him his money back times 10 or more. That model works, but it doesn't work in energy for a variety of reasons. Energy companies, when it comes to new materials, chemistries, processes like these perovskites I was talking about, they require more money. Venture capitalists can't afford it. They require more time. Could be 10 years or more for them to scale up their lab innovation. And once they ultimately do provide their innovation, bring it to market, the very few that do, they're not going to return you an eye-popping multiple, a 10x or 100x, just because they're entering a highly regulated space with a lot of entrenched incumbents, like these utilities that we've been talking about. So going forward, the model, I think, is we need new kinds of investors, not just venture capitalists. These investors should have a longer time horizon. They should be able to provide more money. They could be family offices. They could be Bill Gates' Breakthrough Energy Fund. We've just heard about an example from Aparajit about what's going on in Israel. In addition to new investors, I think we need a new model, as you mentioned in your question, of a public-private partnership. How does the federal government, for example, in the US, or the national government here in India, or other governments around the world, provide a little bit of funding at each stage of the process? Early stage research, applied development, prototyping, pilot facilities, demonstration of the first of a kind facility. At each stage, there has to be a little money available in order to embolden the private sector to invest, because they won't invest otherwise in this really hard sector. So that's what I've learned. But I love your idea about what if a pool of investors didn't just invest in Silicon Valley. They invested in Israel and Silicon Valley and Japan and South Korea and India. I was going to get there. And together, if for some systemic reason in Silicon Valley, all your companies go bankrupt because like they didn't know their market very well, or they had hubris, well, you may be diversified. So thanks for the idea.
Yeah. Can I go for the next question?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's innovative.
I have a question for Varun. I know you mentioned mobility briefly, but I would really like to know more, as you posed that you cannot bring the solar energy and carry it in your vehicles, but you are seeing two solutions, dominant solutions, at least right now. That is, one is EV, which is battery powered, and other is hydrogen fuel cell, where people are thinking of making hydrogen from solar. So these are the two. This is like a debate that is formed. But I would like to know where you stand, or what you think about these two ways.
Yeah, I'll disappoint you. I'm not going to tell you whether I like EVs or hydrogen vehicles more. I think it's a false debate, because right now the vast majority of vehicles are internal combustion engine vehicles that use petroleum fuels. And it's not even clear, like there's plenty of space for both of these to coexist, right? At some point, we may have to make decisions. You may have to say, hey, we need a national network of charging stations for EVs, or a national network of pipelines for hydrogen. Or maybe we reuse existing pipeline networks for natural gas for hydrogen. But right now, we're not in a phase where I have to pick which one I like more. Each has its advantages and disadvantages. Hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, they refuel really quickly. They go really far. Frankly, you can use them just like you use your current vehicles. But today, hydrogen doesn't come from solar, it comes from natural gas. So it's not entirely clean. And it's really hard to produce, distribute, store, and use hydrogen. On the electric vehicle side, electric vehicles don't go very far, and they're really hard to recharge. And, except for Tesla, they're not very sexy. So both of these vehicles have a lot of work to do. I think there are important innovation R&D priorities for each of them. I would love to see a future in which we have a large proportion of electric vehicles and we have a large proportion of hydrogen-fueled vehicles. I think it's going to take a multi-pronged approach. We shouldn't just say we're going to go all electric and try and displace petroleum. That may or may not be the right decision. It'll almost surely be a bad bet. Thanks.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. Does anyone have a question for Ray? Well, wait.
I have a question which I think Varun or Ray, both of them can answer. When we talk about solar, we always talk about the technology innovation in generation. We talk about solar panels, the chipsets. My personal view is that the real breakthrough which we need is in the storage technology, the battery technology. What are your views on this?
Yeah, I would agree with that, absolutely. And I think it's coming. I think it's just a matter of time now. I think that's kind of one of the missing links, but you're a technical expert, so let's hear what you have to say.
Well, remember, I only think it's one of the 4 missing links, right? It's no silver bullet. But what do I think storage needs to do? I think one of the kinds of storage is a lithium-ion battery that you find in your cell phone, you find in your Tesla, and that's fine for storing energy up to about 4 hours, maybe 6, maybe 8 hours, but that's the very limit of what you can do with these batteries. But solar is not just volatile over the course of 4 hours. It's volatile over the course of days, weeks, months, and seasons. So if we need to store energy for a longer period of time, a lithium-ion battery is not going to do it for us. I think we should be investing in longer-term seasonal storage solutions. Pumped hydro is our mature technology that can do large-scale storage for longer periods of time. But if you're going to do seasonal storage or multi-day or week or month storage, you're not going to use that battery very much. That means that it has to be super, super, super cheap because you only get to get your revenue back the few times you cycle it per month or year. So brand new, radically new chemistries are going to be needed. My personal favorite, a sodium sulfur flow battery, which technically could get down to the scale of tens of dollars per kilowatt hour or even less. It's so earth abundant. That's honestly the sort of thing that we should be investing in, not putting all of our chips in Elon Musk's lithium-ion Tesla battery. Because frankly, that's not going to do everything we want.
I think we have time for one last question, and then, Kanika, you can ask your question for Ray.
Okay, great. Hi. My name is Beverly. I'm actually here in Indiana Fulbright doing research on climate finance. So I have so many questions for all of you. But in talking about PPPs and bundling and attracting more private finance, which is really important, obviously, to achieving all of these goals, how are you thinking also about protecting public risk and from taking on too much risk and underwriting these loans and underwriting these investments? I mean, there are essentially the same regulatory frameworks still in place in countries like in the US and around the world that led to these financial crises that we're referencing. I mean, really not much has changed. And even as we speak, the US is working to further deregulate parts of the financial industry. And so I think it just I feel a little nervous in hearing underwriting and taking on public risk. And so I'd like to hear thinking about responsible investments and equity.
Yeah.
For the public.
So I'll give you an example for India. So Indian insurance companies are required by law to only invest in anything that is AA rated and above. They're also only allowed to invest a maximum of 10% in any one company's entire portfolio of offering. I would absolutely not want to change either of these regulations because it does exactly what you're saying, protects from exposing yourself to risk greater than you have a willingness to take. The best renewable energy project is BB rated. And the No, I'm just saying, and even if it was a solar park, the government gave you transmission lines on your doorstep, you had the land, you had the clearances, you had everything, you had a guarantee for the imports of the panels that you've got in from China or Malaysia or wherever else, even then it would be BB. And the reason for that is it's the nature of renewable energy, and it's because of the poor financial health of your off-taker, in this case, the DISCOMs. If you were to do that credit enhancement from a BB to a AA, you pay about 2 percentage points, right? That is the bit that public money can be used. So you already know your maximum exposure, and it's budgeted in. You're not actually making your investor prone to any greater risk than they're willing to take. And there is, of course, the normal borrowing that the developer is doing from a bank anyway. All you're doing is that intermediate amount, and you therefore are able to budget it effectively. And you're not necessarily saying, if something goes wrong, I'm actually going to lose 5% or 6%, because that just won't happen. You're only enhancing that much. It can be that for some projects to do that, and in a particular climate, that to do a BB to a AA may cost you more. But you will know that beforehand. It will not be a post hoc correction. And those are the kinds of things that we need to do. We need to think in innovative ways, because thinking in the way that we've been thinking hasn't really gotten us very far. And the other thing is we need a greater acceptance of new ideas, and that's back to the administration point actually, because the people who are in decision-making roles are in those roles because they've been rewarded by the system as it stands today. But we are also in the soup that we are in. Like Ray said, the greatest failure of our time, of climate change, has been because of this status quo. So you need an acceptability of ideas that come from outside of that system. And that, I think, is something that countries around the world, or at least governments around the world, need to become a bit more accepting of these things, because, and especially here in India, where we're still looking very much to find resonance for these ideas.
I agree with what she said. No, I have my own views on it, but we can talk later. You did have one question for it.
What do you think, Ray, is the role of international cooperation, not just India and US, but international cooperation as a whole, in moving the needle on the global energy transition? So it's a very broad question, but do you think that it'll be central to it, and cooperation also sort of on R&D and other things?
Yeah, I do. I think it'll be central. And there are a couple of ways to think about it. One is government-to-government collaboration. One is incentivizing international cooperation otherwise at a private sector level. One would hope that it wouldn't need a lot of government intervention because there would be commercial opportunities available there. But we see, for example, in the United States, a lot of US companies are risk-averse about investing in foreign markets because they have enough opportunity at home. So maybe there is scope to really try and find a niche where governments can play a catalytic role. And I think so I'm thinking about the idea that you just offered, where you're covering that 2% risk. I don't know if there's a corollary to that in terms of fostering international collaboration or not, but yeah, absolutely. One would hope that there would be lots of scope and lots of mutual benefits that would come from that type of collaboration.